Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to all the panelists esteemed to this session of Vapors, which is a session which talks about innovations and tips in the VR surgery. We today have an esteemed panel with Dr. Manisha, who will be moderating this session. Dr. Lalit Verma, who needs no introduction. He is going to be our coming president for after the next year. Then Dr. Mahesh P. Shanmugam from Bangalore, Dr. Sanjeev Hansraj from Lucknow, Dr. Pradeep Suswar from Chennai, Dr. Avneet Gupta from Delhi, Dr. Prashant Bansal from Nagpur, Dr. Sudipta Das from Kolkata, Dr. Shalabh Sinha from Muzaffarpur, Dr. Vivek Dave from Hyderabad, Dr. Rajiv Reddy from Hyderabad, Dr. Puneet Gupta from Ghaziabad, Dr. Pramod Binde from Chennai, and Dr. Amit Khosla from Delhi. So the topics that we will be covering today will be from the front of the eye to the back of the eye, and we will be going through a series of video clips, which will be followed by the discussions based on the video clips. So with this, can I hand over the thing to Dr. Manisha to start the session, please?
Thank you, Dr. Muralidhar. And I think I just wanted to confirm the order, sir. Do I go first with my video?
Yes, you go first with the video.
Okay, thank you, sir. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Okay. So good afternoon to everyone, and I'm really looking forward to this session today. In the coming few minutes, I would be dealing with managing of a cyclodialysis cleft. And we all know this is basically a separation of the ciliary body from the scleral spur, creating a direct connection between the anterior chamber and the suprachoroidal space, increasing the outflow of the aqueous. Many of these cyclodialysis cleft, if they are small, they close spontaneously. However, those which don't close spontaneously, they cause a chronic hypotony, leading to hypotony, maculopathy, optic disc edema, and a decrease of visual acuity. The various causes can be blunt trauma, which is the most common, and then any intraocular surgery can also lead to a cyclodialysis cleft. We can diagnose them using gonioscopy, a UBM, or an anterior segment OCT. And various treatment options have been described in literature, such as using cryopexy or doing an anterior scleral buckle with cryotherapy, or even a direct cycloplexy where you suture the ciliary body directly to the sclera using a 10-0 nylon suture. But for the large cyclodialysis cleft, the option only described in literature is a pars plana vitrectomy with cryotherapy, and also using a CTR, which is suture to the sclera, suturing the ciliary body back to the sclera. So there are very few options available for larger cyclodialysis cleft, which are extending more than 3 to 4 clock hours. So today I present a novel approach for repairing of a 360-degree cyclodialysis cleft. 14-year-old boy with badminton racket injury to the right eye and vision of 624 N24 and a pressure of 2 millimeters of mercury. There was subluxated lens and hypotony maculopathy. There was 360-degree cyclodialysis cleft.
Here's how a sewing machine works. There's a threaded needle above the fabric. When it pierces the fabric, a rotating shuttle hook below catches the thread.
We present the sewing machine technique to repair a cyclodialysis cleft. Lensectomy and vitrectomy was done, followed by intra-op gonioscopy to confirm the extent of the cleft. A scleral flap was made and 10-0 Prolene suture was threaded into a 26-gauge needle. And the needle was cut off. The needle with Prolene suture was passed through the cleft, and a loop was taken out, which was kept in place with the help of a 30-gauge needle. This was repeated multiple times, and multiple loops were taken out, which were kept in place with the help of the 30-gauge needle. 30 gauge needle was extended to keep all the loops in place, and the suture was finally pulled out. And the tenoproline suture was then passed through all the loops. The 30 gauge needle was removed and the suture was tightened. This was repeated on the other side as well. The follow-up at 12 weeks showed a vision of 6.9N6 with an intraocular pressure of 18 millimeters of mercury. So
Thank
now
you, Manisha. Thank you, Manisha. I think this was a very nice video. I had a very small question for you. How different is it from the previous techniques?
So whatever techniques we have described in literature are mainly managing so they're all small cyclodialysis cleft. However, if we want to manage the larger ones, more than one quadrant cyclodialysis cleft, then we have to do a complete vitrectomy with a gas tamponade with a cryopexy. Here, apparently, I had to resort to a lensectomy because it was a subluxated lens. And that is why I had to do removal of the lens with some amount of limited vitrectomy. But this technique can be very easily performed even without a vitrectomy. So it actually helps us to be doing a repair of a much larger cyclodialysis clefts.
Manisha, how did you know what is the extent of cyclodialysis?
So I showed that we did an intra-op gonioscopy. We reconfirmed. So before taking on to the surgery, we in the OPD, and we also did a UB to assess. But then I wanted to be doubly sure, so we did an intra-op gonioscopy again to assess the extent of the cleft. So it was actually a 360-degree cleft that we would.
Oh, that's very good. Very, very
Dr.
nice.
Manisha, can I ask? Since he was a young boy, why didn't you do a normal phacoaspiration with a CTR and put in a lens rather than doing a lensectomy for him? Because he was a young boy.
Subluxated lens. Hello. It was a very grossly subluxated and a cataractus lens.
There was not much of zonular dehiscence that I could see on the photograph. You could have put in a Sioni ring if you wanted to suture that to the sclera. And if you remember the iris suturing technique, which is similar to yours, they have shown that if you create a small gutter in the sclera, that these sutures, they get inside the sclera so that they are not exposed in the long run outside. In your technique, you have not created that gutter. So I would probably, if you have a gutter, partial thickness scleral gutter, these sutures are inside the sclera and not exposed in the long run.
Yes, I agree that that's always an option. Like we do an SFIOL also, you can always create, but that would mean creating that gutter 360 degrees because you had the sutures all around.
I'm afraid we will need to move on to the next one. I'm sorry, the discussions need to be a little controlled for the interest in time. Manisha, can you take over for the next person to invite?
So, sir, so now I invite Dr. Lalit Verma, sir, and he would be showing an interesting video of subretinal cannula and what can go wrong during this procedure.
Thank you, Manisha, and congratulations to Murli as well as Puneet for this wonderful session. You see, all of you are great visual surgeons. I am presenting one patient who had, retinal detachment, a routine-looking retinal detachment, but we were caught. This was a 49-year-old gentleman. He had in the right eye signs of anterior uveitis. We could see posterior synechiae and irregular pupil, pigment, and mild cataract, not much. Left eye was normal. This was the fundus photograph I had taken pre-operatively, a predominantly nasal detachment. Our vision was 6/60. So just I'll present this video. We started in a routine way. I had put in a band in this patient because of his age plus phakic status, which I normally do in most of the phakic, plus his pupil. On the table, it somehow became dilated, but preoperatively. And what you see here is a subretinal location of the cannula. Although once we started, we did check the position like we normally do. And you see, we did check the position. Position was okay. That is the reason we started. And but as the vitrectomy was continuing, we removed this gel vitreous. I noticed this subretinal cannula of endoilluminator. And then vitrectomy became tougher. This was the inferior part, a lot of pigmentation there, and a couple of breaks there just behind the lens. And because it was becoming difficult, so I injected some amount of PFCL with the illuminator stick being subretinal. At this time, whatever vitrectomy I could, I did, and then shifted this endoilluminator probe further nasally. This led to clutter of instrumentation, but I could complete most of the vitrectomy slowly and gently, and injected PFCL also. A couple of more breaks which were there pre-operate, and then removed all the bands, PVR bands which I could. And at this juncture, I thought enough is enough, and Retina had, this was one iatrogenic break which got created. I used the same one for endo drainage. And once we started doing airflow, removed the PFCL, retina became further bullous. And at this time, something happened, and air became subretinal. You can see the upper port having subretinal air. So at this juncture, I rechecked the infusion. This had also become subretinal now, which it was not before. Then I made another port. Now the number of ports are 5 at this time. Shifted the infusion cannula vertically, no step entry, and then, frankly speaking, could do the complete airflow exchange. Subretinal air coming out at that time from the same port, and could wriggle out of this drastic, dangerous kind of complication. This patient had a lot of cryo or this laser marks before, and ultimately injected oil because of the multiple breaks he had, then lasered all of them. There were 6 breaks in total, 2 inferiorly, 2 upper temporal, and 1 upper nasal. So all of them were lasered. And at the end, this patient did settle down. But during surgery, this created tense moments, definitely. These are a couple of pictures per operatively I could capture from the screen. I thought I'll show. So take home was that you see there are some red flag signs once the illumination becomes less, or the ports are not visible, RD suddenly becoming balloonous, or air goes subretinally. The only issue was this patient had come 2 weeks after my initial examination, so we saw him on the table directly. So we should always be doing an indirect just before surgery. And if some subretinal cannula happens, then most important, maintaining your calm. And frequent change of instrument should be avoided. And sudden movement can lead to creation of iatrogenic breaks. And change of ports is always advisable. Although I have done a couple of patients where I have put the cannula in the AC also, even in a phakic eye. So ports should always be vertical in any anterior segment pathology where you have uveitis or endophthalmitis or small pupil, RD plus CD. Whenever choroidal thickness is more, it should be a single step entry, and that can avoid such kind of complication. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lalit sir. I think this is a complication we all face in our day-to-day ORs. there's a question, sir, that if many a times what happens initially when we start the surgery, we find that the tip is inside, but during the surgery, sometimes it slips out again into the subretinal space or in the suprachoroidal. So
Yeah.
are there any telltale signs for, recognizing that early?
Yeah, this inferior temporal cannula was initially intravitreal, but once we started, it became subretinal. So retina will become suddenly balloonous, and or if you start the airflow exchange, air will go into subretinal space. So sudden ballooning of the retina, which it was not prior to it, is a telltale sign that your cannula has become subretinal.
Any other
So-
comments or?
So one important comment is ki always change the port. If you
Yeah.
continue with the same port, then this problem will keep on reoccurring. Like Sir did, he said it was subretinal. He made it into the intravitreal cavity, but the success came when he made another port, and that was a vertical port. I also had this situation again. Cannula went subretinal, but changing port is key to the success of the surgery.
Yes, I think, Manisha, can we go to the next one, please?
Yeah, sure, sir. So now I invite Dr. Mahesh, and he would be showing an interesting video on post-traumatic iris cyst management.
Thank you, Manisha. Thank you, Murli. You can see my slide.
Yeah.
You able to see my? Yeah. Okay. Sure.
Sir, we can't hear you.
Yeah. Now, yeah. Sorry. This is a 19-year-old male with history of injury to the left eye with cricket ball. Primary repair of corneal tear was done elsewhere. And 6 months later, he underwent cataract surgery and intraocular lens implantation at our own place. And post-operative visual acuity was 636. So at that point in time, he had hardly anything. You can see the corneal scar, and there is some kind of an iris injury here. But subsequently, around 10 months later, you can see a small cyst happening. And 13 months, in about 3 months, it's kind of grew this big. So this is the size of the cyst which is here, and it's encroaching on the pupil. He was having decrease in vision. So we had to do something. So the UBM shows the cyst in the retroiridal space and encroaching onto the pupil here. So this is the surgery which we did. You can see the wound which had been repaired earlier. Opened up the limbus and entered the anterior chamber and used visco to peel the cyst from the corneal endothelium and used the iris spatula and used the intraocular scissor to cut at the side of the scissor at the cyst without trying not to rupture it, and dissecting the cyst and the iris from the ciliary body. And then we entered the anterior chamber, and you can see the cyst prolapsing out. The intraocular pressure was slightly on the higher side, and the iris, the plan was to resect that iris and the cyst. So now the cyst is collapsed outside the eye. The contents of the cyst did not go into the eye, and then close it up. So as I mentioned, the patient was pseudophakic, and now we have a sector iridectomy inferiorly, which we used the slip knot technique to repair it. So railroad it and bring out the loop from inside the eye using the intraocular forceps and pass the end of the free end of the suture through the loop a couple of times or 3 times. And grab the 2 ends, and you can see the sector iridectomy becoming a peripheral iridectomy. This cyst doesn't recur until now, and he continues to maintain good vision. So this is cutting the end of the Prolene sutures from inside the eye. So that's the end of my video. Do you want me to go to the other one, or do we have a discussion now?
You can go to the next one, and then we can have a discussion.
Okay, then, sure. Next one is a different one. This was a 21-year-old with family history of Warner-Lindau disease, and some of them have had retinal detachment also, his brothers and sisters. And this kid also had retinal detachment. And to make it more challenging, he had a macular hole under an angioma. The original plan was to support the angioma and the fibrous tissue with the buccal. So I placed a sutureless buccal. Went ahead with the vitrectomy. You can see PVD is already there. And he did have a macular hole also. And this angioma we hadn't treated earlier. So the fluid was coming out to the macular hole, drained the macular hole, the retinal attachment from the macular hole. And went ahead with the peripheral vitrectomy. See, this is the angioma in the periphery. So it's in the extreme periphery, almost at the ora, with fibrous tissue. So larger angiomas, I prefer to do brachytherapy, shrink it, and support with the buccal because you can resect it. But then more the resection, more is the chance of eye becoming tricycle subsequently. So I don't resect all the angiomas. There's a bubble of perfluorocarbon and using BBG through the perfluorocarbon to stain the ILM. And the peeling of the ILM under the perfluorocarbon. I thought I'll leave it behind. So I thought, as I mentioned, I thought I'll support it. But then when I went back to dissecting the fibrous tissue around the angioma, it was very densely attached and the retina was contracted. So I was forced to do a retinectomy and removal of the angioma. This patient is phakic and there's a phakic base excision. As you can see, because he is young, we are able to manage dissecting the retina and the angioma almost up to the ora. You can see that the cannula. And it's just a question of how much we depress and how much suction we use. We are able to dissect the angioma and the fibrous tissue without touching the lens. Patient remained phakic at the end of it also. So as I mentioned, I don't like to resect angiomas, but this was one of the rare situations where it was so contracted, the buccal wouldn't support it. So we resected the angioma. You can see the buccal effect and the retinectomy falling right over the buccal. We reattached the retina with air and then did laser photocoagulation. So that's at the end of the surgery with the oil. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for both those very interesting videos. Puneet sir, are there any questions from the audience?
No, there is no question from the audience.
Sir, regarding, can I ask a question?
Sure, sir.
Sir, Mahesh sir, why not do an YAG iridectomy, iridectomy for the iris cyst as an initial management in a retention cyst? Many times you can do away with that.
I have done that before. I have posterior iris cyst I have done, but in this patient, what has happened was it was in opposition with the endothelium, and there was no pigment. So this is a post-traumatic cyst, so there was no pigment for the. I have used argon laser also for it to absorb and contract it, but here I could not use argon laser. I didn't want to rupture it and create an inflammation. And again, it was in touch with the endothelium. That was the reason I thought we'll resect it.
Shanmugam, can you be always sure that once you are dissecting the cyst, because you have to separate all the lesions, and at the base of the, at the cyst, can you always be sure that you have, done the complete dissection before you prolapse it out?
Yeah, that was the original plan, Dr. Lalit, was to do a little bit of a cyclectomy also. But then, like when I prolapsed it out and used the UBM also, earlier UBM, where it was arising from, that part had prolapsed out. Because in the interest of time, I have edited out that part of the video. So made sure that area where it was arising from was also included in the resection.
Okay.
Latter case, that is the angioma case, sir. What was the post-operative response? Why do we get, if we operate such cases, in spite of resect angioma, we get these patients end up in a long term after silicone oil removal with severe recurrences and then going into thysis? How do we prevent it?
No, that's why I stopped resecting it. In this kid, it was just a single angioma in the periphery, so he should do well. But like multiple angiomas, large retinectomies, what happens? They tend to throw up a severe inflammatory response with a lot of exudation and a lot of fibrous tissue formation. And that fibrous tissue is the one which causes cyclodialysis, like the traction of the ciliary body and hypotony. So what I do is to do brachytherapy, shrink the angiomas, and do a large buccal to support it, and do a limited vitrectomy to remove the traction alone. So that seems to work rather than trying to resect it extensively. That results in a hypotony subsequently.
Thank you, sir.
Anisha, can we move to the next one?
Yes. Now I invite Dr. Sanjeev Hansraj, and he would be showing us an interesting video on retrofixated iris tip lens in different situations.
Manisha, can you ask all the subsequent speakers to be ready with their presentations? That would be easier.
Sure, I'll do that.
hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes,
Dr. We can hear you.
Okay. So I am going to show some cases of retrofixated iris clip IOL. As we all are called upon many a times to implant lenses when there is no capsular support, and now various options are available, but then each one of them has its own peculiar problems and learning curves and technicalities. Most commonly used these days is the Yamane technique, but then it has its problems, and you always land up in a lot of, never know how it's going to behave. So I was looking for something simpler and which did not, yeah, I will, which did not involve too much of manipulation inside the eye. And I observed Dr. Eckhart in one of the conferences doing this technique, and it was very, very elegant, more than 10 years ago almost. So since then, I have been practicing this off and on, depending on the type of cases. I'll just, to share the screen, I have, what do I do? I have opened my presentation.
Below, you can see the share screen green color box, the lower part of the screen.
Dr. Sanjeev, your video is low bandwidth. You can stop your video or your original video so the audio will be better. You can mute your video, stop the video.
Okay.
Yeah, now we can see.
All right.
Let's put it in a slideshow.
Yeah. So this is a useful technique. This is the type. These are the lenses. This is the lens which is the original lens which was used, made for this is the artisan lens, but being very expensive. So we have a clone which is made in India, which is of a similar design. And the overall length is about 8.5 millimeters. The optical diameter is, or the diameter or the breadth is 5.5 millimeters, and it has a 10 degrees angulation. So the advantages, as I said, about this technique is it is relatively quicker. It is less, it involves less manipulation inside the eye. You don't need too many special instruments. Of course, you need one lens holding forceps, and I think it's easier to learn than the other methods. The disadvantages being that you need one special type of a lens which is not utilized for in any other circumstance. Then it is dependent on the iris tissue, health of the iris tissue. It should be the iris should be good and healthy so that you can clip the lens onto it. Then pupil gets distorted many a times, so it gets oval. It doesn't remain round. That is one of the things. Cosmetically, it may not look nice, and also the pupil may not dilate very well afterwards. But the lens size, when a bigger lens is used, then the pupil dilates pretty nicely. And the incision has to be about 5.5 millimeters. Although you can use one can use the SICS technique or the scleral tunnel. So here are a few cases. Here is a traumatic cataract, which was appeared to be a very dilated fixed pupil, and there was the PC was damaged. So after having removed the lens, done an anterior vitrectomy, I am now implanting the IOL. This is a limbal incision, so corneoscleral incision at the limbus, and the lens is slipped inside the eye, rotated in the horizontal direction, and then you have to hold it, make it stable and steady with this lens holding forceps, which I have got modified to little extent to make it a little more slim, because if the original one which is available in the market was very big and it was difficult to use it. So one has to change hands and then go on the other side and then take the lens behind the iris, and using this 27 gauge Helon cannula, one can just clip it. So this is the appearance. Here is another patient in whom a foreign body had been removed earlier in a first surgery. And there is this, you can see the corneal scar and the sutured corneal scar. The iris tissue is a little bit compromised. The pupil is, I thought that there was enough tissue available to be able to clip the lens. One is being a little careful in slipping the lens inside so that it doesn't get caught in the pupillary edge. The leading edge should not get caught there. So after having put it inside, again the same procedure. This is you can see a scleral tunnel. So if you use a scleral tunnel, then you can also do away with sutures. One leaves some air inside the chamber, and by the next day it is quite secure. This is the tricky. the Canon where the edge of the lens is and where you have to clip it to the iris, because it is behind, you cannot see it directly. An iridectomy should be done because sometimes a pupil block can occur, although the lens is angulated and you keep the concave surface forwards. So this is the post-operative condition. In this case, you can see it is pretty nice. This has been taken about 3 months after the surgery. Here is a dislocated PMMA IUL, which is there, and there was a rent in the capsule, but the lens was trying to slip into the posterior segment. So I have removed it. Again, used a SICS incision. It had to be a big incision because the PMMA lens was inside. So it had to be removed as a whole, and the same procedure has been done. Here is a case of microspherophakia in which a vitrectomy lensectomy has been done. And after that, this lens of a slightly different design I'm using because I wanted a smaller lens, because this was a smaller eye and I was able to get a lens of a smaller size, and I have used it. It is a little different, having different design of the clips. So this was the first time I was using it. I wasn't sure as to how much pressure will be required to entangle the iris or enclave the iris in the clip. So there has been a little bit of a hyphema on the right side, temporal side, and for the other side it was all right. So this is a useful technique, and it is good to have these lenses in your stock because this is very fast and one can does not require to manipulate too much inside the eye as you have to do in lenses with large haptics when you use them for scleral fixation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sanjeev. Those were very interesting videos. Any contraindications, sir, for this procedure? Dr. Sanjeev,
as I said,
Hello.
Yeah.
I think we need to go to the next presentation, Manisha. We are running a little late.
Okay, sir. So Dr. Amit Khosla is the next speaker, and he would be showing videos on Enigma in ROP.
Good afternoon. So my interest came at seeing a news of the most premature child ever born, 243 grams, 21 weaker, and you see the eyes are normal. So today, this as we are saving younger children, the incidence of ROP will go higher. And we need to understand that a lot of people who have not been exposed to ROP, vitreous surgeons, would like to start vitreous surgery. I'm showing about a 10-year-old video where I just started the ROP surgery. We need to understand in ROP, the traction can be behind the lens to the ridge, between the ridge and the ora, and these need to be removed for the traction to go down and try to create a PVD. This video, I have fast forwarded it. So use a 25 gauge trocars, do a core vitrectomy, try to remove the vitreous behind the lens, do a PVD, go along the ridge and try to remove the vitreous from the ridge so you can reduce the traction. You have two kind of cases, one which have been lasered before and one which have not been lasered. You fear the one without the lasers because they are the medical legal problems you will hand up because the patient is going to be aggressive. Those who have been lasered, majority would today with the combination of anti-VEGF and lasers, if you are following up a child, unlikely go into stage 4 or 5. But you have occasional patients who don't follow up. This child did not get an eye checkup done, landed with 4A, for which I did a laser before I planned the surgery. So I was trying to create a PVD, but was not easy in the beginning. In the meanwhile, I tried to trim the periphery. So sometimes you don't use tricot. I didn't use a tricot to see the vitreous. So, and the maneuverability goes down because the lid doesn't open so well. Your maneuverability goes down of trying to use the instrument. So that learning curve, and use the non-contact lens to do the vitrectomy. So it's important that if a break is created, then you lose the eye. But if you were to create a break in the attached retina, then you need to laser it and put in gas, which works. I had one case which I inwardly touched the attached retina and the hole did see. But if you make a hole in the detached retina, then it's difficult. You basically have to abort the surgery. It is not going to settle down. Now, these cases, the surgery seems simple, but the long-term follow-up is an issue because majority of them will develop a cataract or a glaucoma. So it's important the follow-up under anesthesia, sedation is difficult. So the long-term follow-up is as important as the surgery, and hope we can reduce the incidence of stage 4 and we educate our neonatologists to have better care and we can better screening procedure. So I tried in this patient to do a PVD, could not get a full PVD, but I trimmed and the patient did well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. Are there any comments from any of the panelists?
Dr. Amit, nicely done surgery. I was wondering if a buckle would have worked in that patient because the macula was in its place only. So on peripheral, there was not much of a TRD in that sense.
Yeah, I think shifting to lens pairing vitrectomy. That time I have given up the buckle. I thought lens pairing vitrectomy may have, some people say, better results than the buckling. But normally when we buckle, it was only the nasal side or a small TRD. I think buckle or encirclement would have happened, would be a safer option in the long term.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. If you could stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, thank you.
I now invite Dr. Pradeep, and he would be showing us some interesting videos how to deal with the anterior hyaloid phase.
Manisha, I'm here. Join back.
Okay, good, sir.
Can you see? Yeah.
Yes.
Pradeep.
Okay. Good afternoon, all, and I thank Puneet Gupta, PB sir, and Muralidhar for making me a part of papers here. Mine is not a very innovative thing, but many a times we come across the blood-stained vitreous stuck to the anterior hyaloid phase, and we find it difficult, though not in all the cases we come across. So I thought, let me make our own concepts dealing with this AHF little more clearer from our basic concepts, like when do we remove, when we don't remove, and how do we remove, and what are the extent. So I thought in this small video, and most of the vitrectomy we see, like the video which is shown here, majority of our vitrectomies we completed even without even thinking that there was an anterior hyaloid phase which was troubling us, and many a times we leave it in the periphery with little more blood in the stuck to the posterior capsule also. So it means that the anterior hyaloid phase, if it is relatively clear, either in phakics or pseudophakics, does not have much of disturbance need to be removed compulsorily. But when you come across a case where you start your vitrectomy like this, and once you go inside, you don't see anything. There's no view absolutely because of the turbid vitreous or some of this debris which is stuck to the anterior hyaloid phase, you are stuck. So at this point of time, we need to definitely remove. So the basic indication of AHF removal is only for our visualization purpose, so that our vitrectomy can be completed adequately and successfully. So how do we go about it? So I prefer to have it with a direct illumination from the microscope, not to use with any of biome lenses. So one port, the light pipe goes just beyond, the light pipe should be as in the periphery, just beyond the cannula inner tip. The other ports goes with the cutter. You go with the contour of the posterior capsule, start pinching it. You get a dimple there, and you pull it downwards posteriorly, and you start nibbling it with a cutter. And once you start one or two, it retracts back and come back to its own place again. So again, you start with the cut edge of the membrane, again pinch it, pull it downwards, and then again start cutting it. So more you keep doing it, so slowly the membrane gets separated from the posterior capsule, and there is a little cleavage which is more accessible now. So you can just keep doing in a clockwise way, and so that the central clarity is adequate for your vitrectomy, as long as you don't compromise on your peripheral dissection of the vitrectomy. So that means to say, like, how much extent we need to go. So this is the slide where in each port, like nasal port or a temporal port, it's that we will be able to navigate at least about 120 degrees on either side. As you see in this video, I could able to go up to 6 o'clock from the same side and clear the vitreous membrane as much as possible to the extent. So only thing we need to remember is to avoid any vitreous skirt falling from the superior anterior hyaloid face, so that it does not become nuisance for the patient's day-to-day activities because of the upright position. Not that all the blood need to be cleared from the periphery, because we need to keep it as intact also as possible, unless if it is very thickly adherent with the blood, we might have to debulk it as much as possible. So with this small video, what the nuggets, what we can think is that it's only the turbid or the anterior hyaloid face or opaque face we need to remove, and the removal is only for the visualization purpose for our good vitrectomy steps. And vice versa, not every or each and every vitrectomy needs to have an anterior hyaloid face removal, and not necessary that we need to remove it completely in all the cases, except for very few situations, which maybe the panelists can enumerate what are the specific conditions where we can remove it completely and without any compromise. And direct visualization is definitely better for a better depth perception when we handle the anterior hyaloid face. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pradeep. And I think this is a very common practical problem that we all face. And I think we've all learned it the hard way, especially when we are planning a diabetic vitrectomy, where often in young diabetics, we forget to see the lens and the anterior hyaloid face on the slit lamp before planning a surgery. So I think you beautifully highlighted all the tips which we can all manage and use to manage this anterior hyaloid face, which is badly stuck to the posterior lens capsule. I'll just request all the attendees to post their questions in the question and answer session. Any comments from anyone in the panel?
Yes, I would like to add that when you are cutting the anterior hyaloid face, let the port face sideways so that it doesn't hit your lens by accidentally. If you're keeping it sideways, the chances of your catching the posterior capsule or nibbling the lens is less. Just keep the cutter sideways.
Okay. Yeah.
So we'll move on to the next presentation by Dr. Avendra Gupta, and he would be speaking on some interesting mounts that he saw after clearing up the vitreous hemorrhage.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'll be showing one of the cases which I got stuck. And if you can see, there is a dark black glow. And if you have this dark black glow, then be attentive. You are going to face some problem. So this was a case of organized vitreous hemorrhage. I couldn't see the retina. Ultrasound showed mounts, and I misdiagnosed it as rhegmatogenous retinal detachment. So I went on to clear the vitreous hemorrhage. There was almost a total PVD, and you can see the hemorrhage is pretty thick, and it's coming as en bloc. And once you see the posterior pole, you can see this mounts almost 360 degree. I've never seen this mounts at 360 degree appearing like choroids, but actually these are not choroids. So what I tried putting PFCL so that these mounts tends to settle, but with PFCL there was no alteration in the mounts, and you can see we can visualize the disc with lot of difficulty. You can see dark black areas here of vitreous subretinal heme and clear area, and this is the clear area. So at this stage, I just want to put in question, what is the diagnosis? I think with the August gathering, the diagnosis is clear as PCV. So my first question is, should we leave this or drain it? If drain inside or outside, leave it on gas or oil. So questions are open to the panel.
MPS, sir?
Yeah, this is PHCR and it's subretinal blood. That's what you can see. So draining from inside can be difficult because it can be actually thick, and like the way it is not moving with the PFCR inside, so it may be difficult. So I would usually do external drainage, use a cut down and then drain. And sometimes what I've done is like multiple places I have drained and left them open also. So the blood drains in the postoperative period also. That's what I have done.
Any other comments?
Sir, is there any role of putting subretinal TPA in these patients and then drain externally? Because a lot of times we get these clots getting stuck in the external drainage, choroidal drainage areas.
Yeah, you can, but this one is most likely, most of it is liquid is what I would think, because it's not probably clotted. And so I would think like you can try it, but then like if you have to put TPA, then you don't know, because like this is, we are seeing it, like what do you call it? Dr. Agnindra is showing us now, but then like when he went inside, he wouldn't have known that there was subretinal blood, isn't it?
I'll show what in continuation what I did, sir. And it was a nightmare for me in this patient. So what I did, what Dr. Mahesh told, he tried to drain from outside. So I made a sclerotomy just behind the limbus. You can see some fluid coming out from here, but I went inside and saw there was no change, absolutely no change. Then I have seen one video from Manisha's side where she has drained the choroids. So I thought I should drain from inside, and I made an drainage retinotomy, and you can see a lot of blood coming out, and it keeps on coming out and out, and still there is no change in the structure. Then what I did, I penetrated the choroid and you can see some blood coming out. But again, I went inside and saw nothing happened, and you can see laser coming nicely, so there is no detachment. But now the patient has full hyphema, and I have drained the hyphema also, but of no success. So extremely difficult cases. What I thought I made a mistake. I don't think so. We should drain from inside, because if you drain from inside, you can land up with the bleach, what Dr. Mahesh has suggested. The only thing what I should have done is I could have left with Alpribacep inside with oil, and don't drain it either from inside and outside. That's what I learned from this case.
So I think that, Avinder, what I had shown, the internal drainage was not the suprachoroidal blood.
Yeah.
And the second thing is that even 1 or 2 cases which I have operated, I don't have as much experience as MPS sir or PB sir, but these cases very often, even after you have operated, there's a lot of clotted blood that you get. And even if you have managed to remove those clots, there's an extensive RP atrophy present. So visually, I don't think that the patients really gain even after you've done the entire clearing up of the blood and all. So I really don't know that if the other eye is good, do we really intervene with a surgical procedure in such eyes? I don't know what is the suggestion of others.
Can I add something? Yeah. Okay. Basically, I think it's there are 2 things here, whether we are dealing with a subretinal blood or suprachoroidal blood. And PCV generally what we look at it, there's a lot of subretinal blood also, and what Manisha rightly mentioned, and quite sometimes it is clotted. It is stuck to the RP, stuck to the retina as well. And total complete clearance will never ever be possible in these eyes, unless you do large retinotomy, maybe 180 degree or more than that, and really scrape out all these things. So that is one thing. But that is more giving you satisfaction, you drain it. But as I said, already a lot of blood and already photoreceptors are damaged because of toxicity. Functional outcome is going to be significantly less. Coming to technical part, as I said, once you make a retinotomy or any opening, and because you cannot drain entire blood, and had that powdery stuff keeps on coming and coming and coming, and what post-operative period you saw hyphema, repeatedly hyphema, you keep on washing. So best way sometimes just leave it as it is, not to remove, because damage has already been done. Okay. So if there is a limited blood, then probably TPA and all those things you can work around. But if it's such a massive clot all over in a subretinal space, how much TPA? And TPA will act as some limited area. Even if you go in a subretinal TPA, that localized area, it will just liquefy. But what about other clot? So these are difficult cases. A lot of practical issues are there. Suprachoroidal, as you may rightly again mention, unless you cut choroid, I mean, suprachoroidal blood minimal will come out, but subretinal blood to drain through suprachoroidal space, you will have to cut the choroid. And there is always risk of cutting some choroidal vessels and inducing some more bleeding. So we do not know, because cutting choroid will be blindly you will be doing. We do not know what. So there is a difference between draining suprachoroidal blood externally and draining subretinal blood externally. Okay. So that we have to keep in mind always. But if you want to go all out, then I would prefer to do large retinotomy, take everything out, then use PFCL to flatten it out. Yes, I mean, anatomically you will achieve success, but don't do half-hearted job. Either do complete or don't do retinotomy at all. Just leave that blood as it is. Eventually it will get absorbed. At least it will not keep on coming in an antechamber, not coming in a vitreous cavity. Again, media will be easy. It will remain because damage has already been done.
So, oil or gas, sir, after the end of the surgery?
Well, if you don't make a retinotomy, if there is no hole, no gas, no oil. But once you have made a retinotomy, obviously you will have to have oil only there, because of a large retinotomy. And laser, what you got? Yeah, because laser you got because of retina and a blood clot, not retina and RP. So eventually long term it will not hold on, because it is not adhesion between RP and retina. Okay, that also. Counseling is very, very important to diagnose this pre-surgery. Good ultrasonography, good history, and talking to patient that yes, we are trying to clear media. It may benefit visually, may not benefit visually also. So actually, if there's PVD already there, other eye is good, and you strongly suspect suprachoroidal. See, eventually this vitreous cavity blood is going to clear, whether you surgically remove or allow it to clear over a period of time. Final vision is going to be same. So, but if you give benefit of doubt, suppose there is a localized area of heme, certain mounts will be there, but there are always few islands where retina is attached. And if that area is functional, definitely vision is going to be better than leaving it like that. So we need to talk to patient, give enough time the patients and attendant to make their decision before going in. We have to make this very clear.
We need to actually finish. I'm so sorry, I have to cut that. Manisha, can we go to the next one, please?
I'll invite now Dr. Prashant Bavankule.
Yeah.
To show his video on managing of intraop bleeds.
Thank you. This is a pre-recorded video for 4.5 minutes.
Not uncommon is the situation when an intraoperative bleed happens during vitreous surgery, compromising an otherwise predictable outcome. Diabetics, hypertension, and patients with renal impairment have increased tendency of bleeding. Anticoagulants like aspirin and clopidogrel does not increase the bleeding tendency and need not be stopped. But the group of drugs which alter INR need to be checked and stopped. These are the various techniques which are at our disposal for achieving an hemostasis if there is a bleed. Now, this is INR peeling being done in a case of a retinal detachment. And suddenly, when I'm peeling, there is an avulsion of a vessel. Here, the whole vessel is avulsed. Here, I raise the intraocular pressure, drain the blood, identify the cut ends of the blood vessel, and after that, I cauterize only the cut ends of the ligated, or rather, we cannot ligate, so we cauterize the ends of the blood vessel and achieve an hemostasis. Second case, here, a case of a retinal detachment with anterior PVR. And here I am peeling the peripheral membranes. I create a small drainage retinotomy over here. And while I am creating a drainage retinotomy, there is a big bleed over there. Probably I have damaged a choroid. I cauterize. The blood has gone subretinally draining with the help of a flute needle. It's not coming out so easily. I now use a forceps to drain it off. And again, I complete the retinectomy, which was essential for flattening the retina. And again, the ooze starts. The ooze now is more severe. And I complete the retinectomy, identify the area from where choroid is bleeding, and then I cauterize with the help of a routine cautery. And then the routine steps were uneventful. A case of a proliferative diabetic retinopathy, where we have almost complete at the end of the completion and the last part of the membrane being peeled. And what I noticed when I'm peeling this, the blood has gone subretinally. This subretinal blood, now I'm trying to remove the pre-retinal blood, but the hemorrhage subretinally is going on increasing, and probably it might come into submacular region is the fear. And so I created an retinectomy and tried to remove the clot over here. Now when I'm trying to remove the clot, the ooze continues. Yes, I do succeed in achieving removing that clot, but the bleed starts again. Finally, here, we could not achieve a good hemostasis. The blood kept on percolating. We did cautery, we raised the intraocular pressure, but finally we used a PFCL bubble, first initially to protect the submacular creep, and then to pressurize the bleeder. And we could achieve an hemostasis by putting a large PFCL bubble. This is another case of proliferative diabetic retinopathy, where we are trying to remove the last part of the fibrovascular tissue, which is attached over here over the disc. And when I try to pull up the fibrovascular tissue over the disc, the ooze starts from the disc. We raise the IOP over here to achieve hemostasis. We keep on draining the amount of blood which is accumulating over the macula, but still the ooze continues. You cannot use a cautery over the disc, and here I am draining the blood. So finally I decide that yes, the ooze is minimal, so I should continue with the rest of the step. Probably the time would help in achieving a hemostasis. Yes. And so I have completed part ILMP, draining the intermittently the blood which is accumulating over the disc, and still the ooze continued. And then I decide to press that ooze at the posterior over the disc with the help of a closed blunt forceps. And you can see where we, after pressing it, we could achieve an hemostasis. So to conclude, there are various steps to control intraoperative bleed, and you have to go in a stepwise pattern. You have to raise intraocular pressure. Sometimes, especially the disc bleed can be stopped with a simple pressure with a blunt instrument. Try to use cautery minimalized because it causes necrosis of the retina. And rarely, if the bleed is quite high, fluid air exchange and PFCL can be of a rescue. So most important thing is perseverance on such difficult roads can lead you to a predictable outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prashant. And we'll move on to the next video by Dr. Sudipta.
Doctor, I just need to interrupt you in between. Just a gentle reminder that we have exactly 25 minutes left to end this session.
Yes.
Sure.
We'll just move on to the next speaker, Dr. Sudipta Das, because he's also dealing with subretinal hemorrhage.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you, ma'am. Are my slides visible?
Yes.
Yeah. So I thank Muralidhar sir, Dr. Puneet sir, and AIOS and Vapors team for this opportunity. So I'll be going, this is a patient, 66-year-old female hypertensive lady who reported to us with dimness of vision in the left eye for last 3 weeks. And if you can see in the fundus, the right eye, we had some scar in the perimacular area. Left eye, the areas are organized as well as fresh subretinal mounds. Vision was 6/60 and 36. Right eye was 6/6, had some history of laser for extrafoveal IPCV in the right eye, and it was pseudophakic. Left eye had a significant cataract. We planned for cataract surgery with subretinal TPA and AR after vitrectomy plus C3F8 and injection anti-VEGF. So this is a video of the presentation. So this case, we had to do a cataract surgery because of its significance. Following cataract surgery, we started doing vitrectomy. PVD was induced, and we could see the macular area with lot of dehemoglobinized yellowish organized hemorrhage, as well as fresh hemorrhage. So vitreous was removed in So after that, once vitrectomy was completed, we injected some amount of, usually I follow a 25 microgram in 0.1 ml TPA. So that is being introduced by 40 gauge needle. So very tiny proportion, maybe hardly 3-4 bubbles is good enough to create small blisters in the subretinal space. So this was this one area which was swelled up by TPA. And after, these are the other areas where you can see a very nice blister over the posterior pole. So I wait for a minute after giving this tissue plasminogen activator, followed by subretinal air, filtered air. Also very tiny bubbles. You have to be very cautious about injecting these tiny bubbles in subretinal space. And this was after the bubbles. You can see a very nice blister with cocktail mixture of TPA and air subretinal. This was followed by fluid gas exchange, and it was exchanged with C3F8, and intravitreal anti-VEGF was given. I didn't give subretinal anti-VEGF. So this was post-operatively 2 weeks. We could see the C3F8 bubble and significant resolution of this organized dehemoglobinized blood in the macular area. This is a little clearer picture. We can see almost resolution of subretinal hemorrhage and the organized hemorrhage. This was a post-op chronological OCT. It was treated at Shankar Nethralaya. So we could see the initial, it was in June 2019. There was still some amount of organized heme here, some amount of subretinal heme. And we followed it till after 8 to 9 months after surgery. OCT, the anatomical OCT was reasonably very good. And this was the post-op 8 months, where you can see significant change in, and vision also improved around 6/9 in 8. We could see only a paramacular scar in the left eye and some amount of inner retinal wrinkling. OCT was reasonably good with 6/9 in 8 vision. So things learned in this case, we need to intervene early, which has a role in dramatic resolution of submacular hemorrhage. We know anatomical resolution correlated well with this with functional vision for this patient. Long-term follow-up need adds significantly in the knowledge of overall outcome. But 2 things which I want esteemed panel to comment: natural course of organized dehemoglobinized submacular hemorrhage, which is usually poor, but here we could see there was significant resolution of organized submacular hemorrhage, which has not been studied well in literature, and had subretinal TPA anti-VEGF has done the trick. So this was the so the take-home message: the keystone is timing of surgery in submacular hemorrhage. The earlier is better. Duration more than 2 weeks, NMD, sub-RP hemorrhage, and retinotomy carries poorer prognosis. Visual acuity as presentation and size of submacular hemorrhage are not found to be predictive of final visual acuity in literature. Adjuvant anti-VEGF helps in primary disease regression and subsequent recurrence. And subretinal TP and air and anti-VEGF cocktail can be tried even in cases of organized submacular hemorrhage. Thank you so much.
Dr. Sudipta, thank you. That was an excellent recovery you got of vision in your patient. In the interest of time, we'll move on to the next video by Dr. Shalabh Sinha, and he would be showing cases of performing retinectomy in rhegmatogenous RD cases. And if we have time left, we'll take up discussion at the end of the session. Dr. Shalabh, are you there?
Dr. Shalabh, please unmute yourself. Unmute.
Yeah.
Your screen is not, yeah, yes.
Yeah, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You need to be fast.
Yes. So I wanted to show this case of in a detached retina, when we are facing a stiff retina at the end of having completed a vitrectomy. This was a recurrence. So I went ahead and stained the ILM and did a peeling of the ILM. And this patient already had received a buccal in the previous surgery, but had a small break inferiorly, and I thought that I will be able to drain from the inferior break. But after having done a fluid exchange, I found that there is still areas of stiff retina which is detached, and this is under air that I started to do endodiathermy of the detached where I wanted to do a retinectomy. So you can see here 2 rows of endodiathermy I have done, and then I have gone ahead and done a retinectomy still under air. And what I found was that the introduction of the air inside the vitreous cavity actually increases your field of view, and you can go right up to the periphery and trim whatever anterior PVR membranes that you may encounter and do your retinectomy. And once you've done that, so you can see here the anterior PVR membranes being trimmed right up to the periphery under air. And once your retina falls back on the buccal, you can then so you can see here the retinectomy has been done and the anterior PVR membranes have been peeled, and then you can see that your retina has fallen back on your buccal, and you can do the endo laser on the buccal. I've seen many cases where we try to do a retinectomy under fluid or BSS, and we end up doing a very posterior retinectomy. But if we are doing retinectomy under air, now I've started doing retinectomy under air only, so that gives me a wider field of view, and I can dissect from as far as possible and not have a very large area of choroid left behind, bare choroid left behind. So you can see here that the retina is well settled. You can remove the PFCL bubble and add more laser if you want. In this case, I left it with gas and the retina settled. So no need of putting in oil because you've done a good retinectomy and the laser has taken well, and the break is basically supported by your buccal that was done in the previous surgery.
Thank you, Dr. Shalabh. I think we'll move on to the next video because we are running short of time, and the message is well taken to do a retinectomy under air. Only thing is we have to be careful of the sudden hypotony that somebody may encounter while having a fluid air infusion inside. I'll now invite Dr. Vivek Dave to please screen share.
Thank you, Dr. Manisha. Yeah, I hope it's shared now.
Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead.
Right. I'll quickly run through my presentation on a dry vitreous biopsy for macular abscess in endogenous endophthalmitis. This was a 70-year-old male, uncontrolled diabetic, history of renal failure, both eye counting fingers vision, and a history of 1 week since he was losing his vision. This is what the presentation was. There was mild vitritis. Fundus was still visible through it, and both eyes right at the posterior pole had this hemorrhagic abscess-like picture. These are the OCTs. This is OCT of the right eye, again confirming the posterior hyaloid showing a lot of cells and the abscess which was blocking the reflection through the underlying retinal structures. This is what the left eye was like. So on the presumptive diagnosis of endogenous endoph with abscess at the posterior pole, we went ahead doing a dry vitreous biopsy. So instead of infusion, had the air connected so as to allow me to keep cutting the vitreous till I relatively reach the posterior pole close to the abscess cavity. And at that point, the sister brings in the 2 cc syringe. And now all this area which is close to the posterior pole, this is what is taken into the syringe so that we gather material as close to the lesion as possible. For the want of time, I'll just shorten the video because going ahead, there was just a completion of PVD and vitrectomy. This is what the patient looked like 1 month post-op. We see that the media is clearer. The lesions seem to be contracting. This is what the patient was like 3 months post-op. So from counting fingers, we reached 2600 and 2320. Along this course, the patient received 3 injections of intravitreal amphotericin B as the biopsy grew candida. This is what the OCT was at this last visit. So we see that scarring has started occurring right there at the posterior pole. And this was the other eye. So my question to the panel, if time permits, was for such posterior lesions, would anyone in the panel also have a similar technique, or how would you ensure that you get sample from as close to the lesion as possible? Because many times the anterior conventional vitreous biopsy may be negative in such cases. Thank you.
I'll just request Dr. Vivek, let's complete all the videos of the session.
Sure.
You can take up your question at the end. I'll request Dr. Rajiv to please share the screen and start his video.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just do a slideshow, Rajiv.
Yeah. So I am going to show a small video where we're going to look at what are the challenges and difficulties when you're doing a lensectomy in microcornea. So this is a case where it's a 50-year-old patient who came with one eye anophthalmos and then one other eye is a microcornea like this with a hard lens. And this is like 5 millimeter cornea. So we thought we'll be able to manage this, and they said, anterior segment people said we cannot remove this through the anterior approach. So we started doing lensectomy in this patient. So if you see the challenges are, this is a smaller area, and if you look at this full circle here, so this is the area where you have a lens when you are trying to visualize the posterior segment if you use a biome or a resect. So I had a drop of the lens, and then we tried using a regular visualization. If you see, it's not coming to the center, mainly because the port and the instruments are started pushing the lens away, because they are all close to each other. So it was difficult for me to see the periphery, and whenever the lens used to go away, and then the whole image used to go off, and that was the difficulty which I was facing. So that's when I actually took out my endoscope and then started using an endoscope to look at these areas and see the periphery. And this is how the visualization with an endoscope would be for this. And you have all the freedom to move your instruments wherever you want, and you can actually see the periphery well without having any difficulty. So that's an advantage of using alternative visualization techniques to see in these type of cases. So this another problem which we face in these cases is the hard lens, that is the nucleus, which is brown lens which you are seeing there. So I'll show you one more small clip which you will notice something else which happens here. So this is a case which I was doing something similar, and I suddenly noticed that something else happened suddenly. So you can just wait for a second, then you will know what happens there. This is in a slow motion what happened there. You can actually see the fragmentome. A piece got broken and went off inside. So that's the fragmentome piece which was sitting there inside. So that's a broken fragmentome inside, and I had to deal with that. So this is the broken fragmentome. So that's in short video. These are the challenges which we face, and how I managed that is I had to extend the sclerotomy a little and remove it like a porendo. So in short, that's what it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv. I think that's an interesting application of endoscopic vitrectomy, but one needs to have money in the pocket to buy that. So I think that's the only
how not to have money in pocket and still can do it.
So I think I'll invite, maybe I can have a quick presentation by Dr. Puneet Gupta, who's also showing us an economical way of doing an endoscopic vitrectomy.
So I'll start straight away with my video. Yeah. Endoscopy is undoubtedly a versatile tool for diagnosis and treatment of complex vitreoretinal conditions. I think there are two main reasons for endoscopic surgery not being popular. The is cost of the equipment, and the second is insufficient image quality because of the outdated components. I am presenting a novel, cost-effective, yet efficient modified portable camera endoscope for VR surgery. Commercially available endoscopy system has a base unit and a monitor. The base unit has an illumination source, video camera, an interface for the fiber optic endoscope, and optional laser photocoagulator. I present a feasible, cheaper, but more efficient approach for endoscopy.
Puneet, can you mute yourself?
Portable GoPro.
No, you can't hear your audio.
No, we can't hear you. It was earlier audible.
Unmute.
For illumination. This is the C-mount at GoPro camera.
Can you hear now?
The endoscopic interface is connected to the C-mount. HDMI cable is inserted in the micro HDMI port of GoPro camera and connected to a HDMI interface of a monitor. This is the touchscreen panel for the controls on the back of the camera. Your GoPro camera endoscope is ready for use now after connecting fiber optic endoscopic cable. You can use a separate LED source or a light source of vitrectomy machine and a 4K monitor for even better visualization. This is the endoscopic view with this new endoscope using a 23-gauge fiber optic cable. Illumination, both are better than the commercially available system. If you connect this endoscope to a 4K monitor, the visualization will be even better. If you compare with the commercially available system, the modified GoPro camera has much higher resolution, up to 4K, much higher light sensitivity. It has facility of digital zoom. This is not a bulky system. It can be used as a mobile device. Video output is not the older S video, but an advanced HDMI output, and all that at less than 1/10 of the cost. This article in Retina was a source of inspiration for developing this useful device, that is endoscope for all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think that answers my question to Dr. Rajiv, that this is something more affordable by many of us. I'll quickly move on to the last presentation by Dr. Pramod Bhende, sir, and he would be showcasing the use of 25-gauge vitrectomy cutter as a scissor.
My presentation?
Yeah. Start.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, this is a young diabetic having a bilateral TRD, very florid proliferation, and had a post-Avastin surgery. This is the one eye vitrectomy is already done. What I'm doing, just showing is just membrane peeling. The 25-gauge cutter, that is 10,000 cutter with a bevel tip, can easily be used. So bimanual dissection, you have endo chandelier illumination. What the trick here is, though these are all so-called high cut rate instruments, but when you use it as a scissor, you need to reduce the cut rate significantly. Use a shave mode so that you do not catch retina. I mean, safety margin is improved. So it's each, just like I had a comparative actually scissor mode as well was showing along with, but this will not get time here. So just push the membrane, look at each attachment, and with a low cut rate, maybe even 100 or sometime less than, basically you need a single cut or a little bit more than just like a scissor what you use, and things become much easier, see almost bloodless surgery. So intermittently you can tap the retina back, so that will help you to get a better cleavage plane as well. The membrane is coming out nicely. And you keep on changing the direction of the membrane pull so that you get a better view of the attachment. Basically, that's another key. So don't cut blindly. You look at each attachment, go between the retina, membrane, and the attachment exactly within your port, and then activate the cutter. So, okay, and that's it. So about the membrane has come out, whole thing. And this is what fundus view, both the eyes I operated. This is maintaining good vision last 2 years. So I think just stop here. We can have a discussion if time permits. I don't think so.
Thank you, sir. Yes, we do still have 5 minutes for the discussion, so we can take up a few questions. I think Dr. Vivek, if he's still there, I think he wanted a comment from everybody for collection of samples going as close or as to the abscess. Dr. Vivek?
Yeah, that is what my question was. We just have little anecdotal data where the yield of microorganisms has been relatively higher if we collect sample right from over or through the lesion as compared to the conventional anterior sample collection. But the only thing is, while you reach there, if you do your vitrectomy conventionally, you will be diluting things. So any comments by anyone on how one would approach?
You can visualize with the bio and then take the cutter close to it, and then without switching on the infusion. And because you can go inside without doing an anti-vitrectomy. But only if the vitreous is hazy, then it does shoot. Otherwise, they take a bit of a specimen.
All right. Thank you.
Dr. Puneet, you showed an excellent, cheaper way of creating this endoscopic vitrectomy instrument. So what is the cost of this camera that you used in your system, sir?
Actually, the cost of this GoPro camera is 30,000 rupees, approximately. But the cost of the original endoscopy system, there are two models. One is E4 model that I have, which is a which does not have a laser. So I use my another laser attached with it. That is costing somewhere around 22 lakhs. And the machine that Rajiv has in LVPI and is about more than 40 lakhs. The problem is the VR surgeons cannot buy that equipment. It's so expensive. So, and this equipment, if you the complete cost will, if you include the cost of endoscope also, I think it should not cost more than 4 lakh rupees. And the image quality.
Puneet?
The what, Mahesh?
Endoscope. The fiber optic endoscope.
You have to buy these endoscopes from Endoptics. The dealer of Endoptics will supply these endoscopes, and this is a separate accessory. The cost, basically the problem is the cost of the console is so high. I mean, the endoscope cost is 2.7 lakhs, and the endoscope, this fiber optic.
It really makes it easy, Puneet, and maybe let us look at creating an endoscope also on our own.
Actually, cheap
I think Rajiv will also agree. Endoscopy is a very useful tool for vitreoretinal surgeon. If we can have an endoscope in every vitreoretinal OT in 5 lakh rupees without involving any company in it, I think this will be a very useful innovation which can be used for all.
Situations, Puneet sir and Rajiv, where you feel that this is mandatory, I mean endoscopic, what are those situations where you really use this machine?
See, endoscope. Yeah, Rajiv can answer.
Go ahead.
Sorry, doctor. It's Purnesh. Sorry to interrupt. It's 12:55. I think this would be the last question that we should answer.
This is the last question. We are winding up.
Yes, perfect.
Rajiv, you answer.
Yeah, so this is what I've started using it when we started having a difficulty and when have a K-Pro patients where they have a difficulty in viewing the periphery. But then over a period of time, we realized in post-trauma, endophthalmitis, or any cases where there is a sudden, you encounter a media haze. So it makes it easier for you to see the posterior segment using this. So the advantage of this is like, you don't have to depend completely on corneal clarity or the lens clarity.
Thanks, Rajiv. I'll request Dr. Muralidhar to wind up the session.
Thank you, Manisha. I think we had a wonderful 85 minutes, and I thank each one of the presenters and the panelists for the wonderful cooperation in conducting such a successful Vapers once again. Thank you so much, and we'll look forward to the subsequent Vapers groups again.
Thank you, one. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.